Just days after September 11th, Ana Montes, a top DIA analyst, was arrested for spying for Cuba. For 17 years, she betrayed the US from within, shaking national security to its core. The enemy was closer than they thought. In the early days following the September 11th attacks, national security was at its highest priority. The US government had been rocked by the scale of the tragedy. And in the weeks that followed, the nation sought answers, security, and resolution. Against this backdrop, on September 21st, 2001, the FBI arrested Ana Belen Montes. Montes was a senior analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, the US government's principal intelligence body, tasked with providing critical military and defense analysis to the Pentagon. She had been trusted with some of the most sensitive US intelligence, yet unknown to most, she had been spying for Cuba for over 16 years. Her arrest came just days after the attacks on US soil, a time when the security apparatus was focused on threats from Al-Qaeda. Montes' case did not directly relate to the ongoing investigations into September 11th, yet her espionage was seen as an immediate and grave threat to national security, one that could not be ignored. Despite the overwhelming focus on the attacks, Montes, a civilian worker for the DIA, was deeply embedded in the US intelligence community. Her specialization in Cuban affairs made her invaluable to her colleagues. But it was precisely this expertise that the Cuban intelligence service had noticed years before. Back in the 1980s, Montes was a vocal critic of US policies in Central America, and her opinions caught the attention of Cuban officials who, sensing an opportunity, approached her. By 1984, at the age of 27, she had become a recruit for Cuban intelligence. Her journey into espionage began in the capital of Washington, D.C., where she worked a clerical job at the Department of Justice. She was frustrated with US foreign policy and outspoken in her views. This ideological rift became the foundation for her recruitment. Montes soon met with Cuban agents, and after a series of clandestine meetings, agreed to spy for Cuba. She knew she had to infiltrate the US intelligence community to fulfill her role. And so in 1985, Montes applied for a position at the DIA. She quickly ascended through the ranks, earning a reputation for her skill and knowledge of Cuban affairs. It was here, in this critical role, that she would gain access to classified documents and sensitive intelligence, which she would leak to Cuban handlers over the years. Montes' method was deceptively simple. She never physically removed classified documents from her workplace, an essential precaution against detection. Instead, she memorized the materials, and when she returned home, transcribed the information onto her personal laptop. Then, after receiving encrypted instructions via shortwave radio broadcasts from Cuba, she would transfer the data onto encrypted disks. The final step was handing over the disks during face-to-face meetings with her Cuban handlers, where she would pass on the materials in exchange for further instructions. Montes' espionage remained undetected for years because of her tradecraft, which was meticulous and untraceable. The stakes of her actions were immense. Montes had access to highly classified information about US military operations, strategies, and planned actions. By the late 1990s, she had access to intelligence about the impending invasion of Afghanistan, a key piece of information she would leak to her Cuban handlers just days before the war began. This intelligence could have altered the course of military operations, or even endangered the lives of US service members. As Montes infiltrated deeper into the intelligence apparatus, suspicions about her behavior grew. She was known to have strong anti-American views, but this was not enough to justify an investigation. At the same time, there was no direct evidence to connect her to espionage. She was meticulous, careful, and had passed numerous polygraph tests designed to expose any disloyalty. There were no concrete reasons to believe that Montes was a traitor to her country, until a colleague, acting purely on instinct, reported his suspicions in 1996. He had noticed her peculiarities, her deep political convictions, and her growing access to classified materials, and felt something was off. The report went largely unnoticed at first, but the seed had been planted. And in 2000, the FBI was investigating an unidentified Cuban agent in Washington, D.C. When the security officer who had first raised concerns about Montes was made aware of the FBI's investigation, he reached out to them. His suspicions were now backed by the knowledge that the US had an active Cuban agent operating within its borders. The FBI launched an investigation, which soon revealed the full extent of Montes' espionage activities. Through physical surveillance, covert searches, and electronic monitoring, the FBI started to piece together the operation, but they needed more than just circumstantial evidence. Montes was careful, and there was no direct evidence linking her to espionage. The FBI waited for the perfect moment, a meeting between Montes and her handler, that would provide the final piece of the puzzle. But as the investigation advanced, the national security landscape changed dramatically. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, Montes was set to be reassigned to work on sensitive war plans involving the invasion of Afghanistan. The potential for her to leak critical war-related intelligence was unacceptable. The decision was made to arrest her before she could gain access to this high-value material. Montes's arrest was a cold, calculated operation that prevented further compromise of U.S. military strategies. In the days after her arrest, the magnitude of her betrayal became clear. Montes had not only provided Cuba with highly sensitive information, but had actively worked to distort U.S. perspectives on Cuba. Her deep ideological commitment to the Cuban cause had driven her to risk everything: her career, her freedom, and the safety of her country, for a cause she believed in. Ana Montes was arrested, charged with espionage, and later pled guilty to leaking classified materials. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison, and her story became a cautionary tale for the U.S. intelligence community. A trusted analyst had become a spy for a foreign government, and it took a combination of intuition, persistence, and a change in national priorities to uncover her betrayal. The story of Ana Montes is not just one of espionage. It is a story of ideology, loyalty, and the thin line between conviction and betrayal. It serves as a reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist within even the most secure intelligence systems, and the personal convictions that can shape and ultimately distort an individual's actions. In the wake of her arrest, the U.S. intelligence community was left to grapple with the long-term implications of Montes' betrayal, an event that would resonate far beyond the walls of the Pentagon. The Office of the Defense Intelligence Agency was quiet, like it always was on a typical Wednesday afternoon. A few people moved silently between their desks, while others focused intently on their work, analyzing classified intelligence, preparing reports, and processing daily tasks. Ana Montes was seated at her desk, eyes fixed on her computer screen, methodically reviewing a series of documents related to Cuba's latest military developments. To the casual observer, she was just another senior analyst, one of the many experts in her department. Her expertise in Cuban affairs was well known and highly regarded throughout the DIA. But hidden behind her calm and focused exterior was something much more dangerous: a secret life she had been leading for years. Since she had joined the agency in 1985, Montes had been a loyal employee. On the surface, she followed the rules, attended meetings, and submitted reports as expected. But from the moment she was recruited by Cuban intelligence back in 1984, she had been living a double life. Montes was not just analyzing Cuban military strategy. She was providing that very information to Cuban operatives working within the United States. Her recruitment had been deliberate, a product of her outspoken views on U.S. foreign policy, especially in Central America. She had no formal training in espionage, but her strong convictions made her an ideal candidate for Cuban intelligence. By the time she began working at the DIA, she had already agreed to help the Cuban government. Montes understood the stakes. If she could gain access to sensitive U.S. intelligence, particularly military operations related to Cuba, she could provide the government with valuable insights, information that could shape the course of U.S. policy. For years, her espionage remained undetected, her actions carefully concealed from even the most astute colleagues. She took meticulous steps to avoid suspicion, never removing documents from her workplace, and instead relying on her memory and a laptop at home to transcribe the information. She communicated with her Cuban handlers through encrypted disks and shortwave radio transmissions, using a cipher to ensure the security of their exchanges. But something had changed. As Montes sat at her desk, reviewing a report detailing U.S. military operations in Afghanistan, she knew her cover could soon be blown. The September 11th attacks had changed everything. The heightened national security measures following the attacks meant that the DIA was focusing on threats to U.S. military and intelligence operations. The pressure to secure classified information had intensified. Montes was about to be reassigned to work on high-level plans related to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the kind of information her Cuban handlers would find invaluable. The urgency of the situation only increased her risk. If her espionage was discovered, it would not only jeopardize her career, but could also lead to the exposure of sensitive intelligence that could be used by foreign adversaries. Her fear was not irrational. She had already begun to feel the weight of suspicion building around her. A colleague, a fellow analyst who worked with her closely on Cuban affairs, had recently expressed doubts about her behavior. There was nothing concrete to report, but the colleague's gut feeling told him something was off. He had noticed her strong anti-US rhetoric, the way she would often criticize American foreign policy and make pointed comments about the country's actions in Central America. It was clear that she did not agree with the U.S. stance on Cuba. But it wasn't enough to raise alarms, at least not yet. In 1996, the colleague had taken the first step toward uncovering the truth. He had reported his suspicions to the DIA's counterintelligence unit, suggesting that Montes might be compromised. The security officer who was assigned to investigate had spoken with Montes, but she denied everything. Her answers were smooth, rehearsed, and convincing. The interview was filed away as inconclusive, and no further action was taken. The security officer's report had been forgotten by most, but not by the one who filed it. He knew there was something deeper, something hidden, beneath the surface. Years passed, and Montes' activities continued undetected. Her ability to maintain her cover was remarkable. She had never made a mistake. No physical evidence ever surfaced to implicate her in espionage. She had passed every polygraph test, and her reports had always been on time. And her colleagues respected her professionalism. She was seen as a dedicated and brilliant analyst, someone who could be trusted with highly sensitive information. No one suspected that the very information they relied on to make decisions was being sold to a foreign government. But in 2000, everything began to shift. A new investigation was launched by the FBI into an unidentified Cuban agent operating in Washington. Montes' name had never been explicitly tied to the investigation, but the decision to scrutinize Cuban espionage activities in the capital created an atmosphere of heightened vigilance. The security officer who had reported his suspicions years earlier was now informed that the FBI had opened an investigation into the Cuban intelligence network in Washington. It was then that he made the decision to reach out to the Bureau. His suspicions about Montes had only grown with time, and he could not ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The FBI moved swiftly, launching an investigation into the suspected Cuban agent. They conducted a detailed review of Montes' activities, scrutinizing her every move and analyzing her access to classified information. Montes, unaware of the investigation closing in on her, continued to operate with the same meticulousness and precision that had allowed her to remain undetected for so long. But there was a new urgency in the air. Something had to be done before Montes was assigned to work on war-related intelligence. The risk of her passing sensitive military plans to Cuba was too great. The decision was made. She would be arrested before she could jeopardize the nation's security. As the FBI intensified its surveillance, Montes began to feel the pressure mounting around her. She had lived in the shadows for so long, but now the walls were closing in. The investigation was reaching its apex, and there were fewer places left to hide. The stakes had never been higher. Every piece of intelligence she passed to Cuba, every encrypted disk she handed over to her handler, had the potential to change the course of history. Montes knew her time was running out. The very thing she had fought for, her ideological commitment to Cuba, was now the thing that would lead to her downfall. Montes had become a liability to both the United States and the Cuban government, a pawn in a game that had played out for over a decade. The FBI had made its decision. They had to act before it was too late. Ana Montes' life had always been defined by the careful balance between her public persona and her covert activities. She was a respected member of the Defense Intelligence Agency, known for her in-depth knowledge of Cuban affairs and her meticulous analysis of military intelligence. She had worked tirelessly for years, always moving like a shadow, making sure that no trace of her true loyalties could be found. But as September 2001 unfolded, the weight of her secret life grew unbearable. Montes had spent more than a decade feeding information to Cuba, but now, as the nation was gripped by the fallout of the September 11th attacks, she could feel the walls closing in on her. The FBI had intensified their investigation into Cuban espionage in Washington, and there was a constant unease in the air that she couldn't ignore. By the time the attack on the World Trade Center occurred, Montes' status within the DIA was almost untouchable. She had become indispensable to U.S. intelligence operations. But the sudden shift in national security priorities, fueled by the urgent need to counter terrorism, meant that everything was about to change. The DIA, which had long trusted Montes' judgment on Cuba, was now preparing for a new crisis: the upcoming war in Afghanistan. Montes, like many in the intelligence community, had been reassigned to work on military operations relating to Afghanistan. The assignment, though an extraordinary opportunity to shape U.S. military strategy, also meant that Montes would soon have access to classified information of the highest value. The shift in her workload was not lost on her. She was well aware that this new assignment would bring her closer than ever to the kind of information that would be critical to the Cuban government. It wasn't just a matter of receiving war plans. Montes would have access to detailed intelligence about U.S. military movements, strategies, and even the vulnerabilities that might be exploited in a potential conflict. Yet, she continued with her work as usual, unwavering in her dedication to her country. She believed in her cause. Her ideological alignment with Cuba and its policies, particularly its stance against U.S. military dominance, had shaped her every decision. The internal tension she felt now, between her duty to the U.S. government and her allegiance to Cuba, was immense. But Montes convinced herself that her actions were justified. For years, Montes had been able to compartmentalize her life. Her role at DIA, her expertise in Cuban military analysis, and her secret identity as a spy for Cuba were kept separate, as if they existed in two different worlds. But now, the boundaries between these two worlds were beginning to erode. Montes had always been careful. No mistakes, no compromises, but the pressure was mounting. By 2001, the tension between Montes' public duties and her secret mission had reached a boiling point. The FBI had been investigating her for nearly a year, following every lead and scrutinizing every move. But as the September 11th attacks unfolded, Montes' activities took on new urgency. The nation's security apparatus, distracted by the horrific events of that day, found itself divided between two monumental threats: the terrorist network that had orchestrated the attacks, and the quiet, insidious espionage activities happening right under their noses. Montes knew that the FBI would soon be closing in on her. She had worked in the shadows for so long that she had become complacent, believing that her methods would protect her. But now, as the investigation deepened, she could feel the net tightening. She had carefully erased her tracks, never leaving behind physical evidence. But Montes had underestimated the persistence of the intelligence community. The clues were beginning to stack up, and the FBI had started to connect the dots. The suspicions that had been raised in the late 1990s had transformed into a full-blown investigation, and Montes knew that the game was nearly up. As Montes continued to carry out her work, she began to feel the weight of every decision she made. Each encrypted message, each transfer of classified intelligence, felt like a thread pulling her closer to the edge. The moment of her exposure loomed over her, and she could no longer ignore it. The information she had passed to Cuba was vital: intelligence about US military capabilities, plans for Afghanistan, and the identities of undercover intelligence agents, and the stakes had never been higher. In the wake of September 11th, national security was the top priority, and the revelation of her betrayal would be catastrophic. The tension inside the DIA was palpable. Montes continued to work alongside her colleagues, but she could sense the growing unease. Her colleagues were shifting their focus to terrorism, while she was still entrenched in Cuban military affairs. The dissonance between their priorities and hers was becoming more pronounced. The DIA was now less concerned with Cuba and more focused on the Middle East. But Montes' continued access to classified intelligence related to Afghanistan and the global war on terror raised suspicions. The questions about her loyalty, once whispered in the hallways, began to grow louder. Montes' carefully curated image of a committed patriotic analyst was beginning to crack, and her colleagues were starting to notice. In the midst of this escalating tension, the FBI remained patient. They had been collecting information on Montes for years, but they knew they needed more than just circumstantial evidence. They needed a breakthrough, an opportunity to catch her in the act, and that opportunity would come soon. As the investigation reached its peak, the FBI's plan was clear. They would wait for Montes to meet with her Cuban handler. She had been passing classified information for years, but the FBI needed that final, irrefutable piece of evidence. They waited, watching her every move, knowing that the moment she handed over another batch of intelligence to her handler, the case would be sealed. The pressure on Montes was mounting, but she had no choice but to continue her work. She had become too deeply embedded in the espionage network, and backing out was no longer an option. As her days at DIA wore on, she could feel the weight of the investigation closing in. She couldn't see the agents watching her, but she could feel them every step, every move. Soon the moment would come, the moment when everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, would come crashing down. Ana Montes had spent over a decade living in the shadows, balancing her dual life with precision and care. But with each passing day, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. The FBI's investigation was closing in on her, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. As the pressure mounted, Montes began to feel the familiar tightness in her chest, the kind of unease that accompanied every clandestine meeting, every encrypted message, every piece of information she handed over to her Cuban handlers. The build-up to her arrest was relentless, but Montes continued to work as if nothing had changed. Her daily routine remained unchanged. She arrived early at the DIA, met with colleagues, reviewed intelligence reports, and contributed to briefings. To anyone watching, she was just another analyst doing her job. But in the back of her mind, she was always calculating, always aware of the stakes. Her ideological commitment to Cuba was unwavering, but she knew the cost of her actions. She had never expected to be caught. And yet, now that it was becoming clear that her time had run out, she couldn't shake the fear that she might be the one to bring down everything she had worked for. The FBI's investigation had reached a critical juncture. Agents had been tracking Montes for months, carefully observing her movements and documenting her interactions. The breakthrough they had been waiting for came in the form of a routine meeting. A meeting Montes had arranged with her Cuban handler, just like she had done countless times before. The FBI knew that this was the moment. They had been waiting for this specific exchange of information, the transfer of classified US intelligence, to catch her in the act. They had no choice but to act quickly. Montes had no idea that the agents were watching her every move, her handler unaware that their meeting was being tracked. On the day of the meeting, Montes felt an odd sense of calm. She had been preparing for it for days, reviewing the information she would provide, ensuring everything was in order. She had come to understand the routine of her espionage so well that it had become second nature. the encrypted disks she would deliver, the decryption of messages she would perform later that night. All felt like routine procedures in the life she had built. Yet beneath her calm exterior, Montes was haunted by the reality that the FBI was closing in. The weight of the knowledge that her every move had been under surveillance was a constant presence in her mind. She met her handler in a secluded park, as she had done countless times before. The setting was familiar. The same bench near a quiet street. The same place where they had exchanged information on multiple occasions. Montes didn't even need to glance at the nearby streetlights to know that they were far enough from the eyes of the public to conduct their business. But this time there was an invisible presence, one that she couldn't escape. As she handed over the encrypted disks, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of finality. She had crossed a line, and the moment she had been avoiding for so long was finally here. The meeting was brief, as it always was. Montes exchanged the materials with her handler, who quickly disappeared into the shadows. She watched him leave, but the sense of calm she had felt before the meeting quickly dissipated. There was a nagging sensation in the pit of her stomach, a sense that the walls were finally closing in. The finality of the moment was inescapable, but she refused to acknowledge the truth. She couldn't admit it to herself yet. She had been too careful, too meticulous for so long to let this be the end. Little did she know, the FBI had already closed in on her. The agents who had been surveilling the meeting had gathered all the evidence they needed to arrest her. Montes' handler had been identified, and her involvement in the espionage operation was undeniable. The moment she returned to her office, she would be confronted with the evidence. The FBI's patience had paid off. They had waited for her to make a mistake, but she hadn't. Instead, they had caught her in the act, no longer a suspect, but a convicted traitor. Montes returned to her apartment that evening, her mind racing, as she prepared to transcribe the information she had just transferred. But the weight of her actions was starting to bear down on her, in a way she hadn't anticipated. She sat at her desk, typing up the encrypted messages, but each keystroke felt heavier than the last. The sense of inevitability was overwhelming. She knew it was only a matter of time before her life would change forever. The FBI had already prepared for the next phase of the operation. Agents moved quickly, ensuring that Montes would not have a chance to destroy the evidence or flee. They waited until she was alone in her apartment, working at her desk, before they moved in. Montes had no idea that the FBI was mere moments away from arresting her. It wasn't until she heard the sharp knock on her door that she realized everything was about to unravel. She met her handler in a secluded park, as she had done countless times before. The setting was familiar. The same bench near a quiet street. The same place where they had exchanged information on multiple occasions. Montes didn't even need to glance at the nearby streetlights to know that they were far enough from the eyes of the public to conduct their business. But this time, there was an invisible presence, one that she couldn't escape. As she handed over the encrypted disks, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of finality. She had crossed a line, and the moment she had been avoiding for so long was finally here. The meeting was brief, as it always was. Montes exchanged the materials with her handler, who quickly disappeared into the shadows. She watched him leave, but the sense of calm she had felt before the meeting quickly dissipated. There was a nagging sensation in the pit of her stomach, a sense that the walls were finally closing in. The finality of the moment was inescapable, but she refused to acknowledge the truth. She couldn't admit it to herself yet. She had been too careful, too meticulous, for so long to let this be the end. Little did she know, the FBI had already closed in on her. The agents who had been surveilling the meeting had gathered all the evidence they needed to arrest her. Montes' handler had been identified, and her involvement in the espionage operation was undeniable. The moment she returned to her office, she would be confronted with the evidence. The FBI's patience had paid off. They had waited for her to make a mistake, but she hadn't. Instead, they had caught her in the act. No longer a suspect, but a convicted traitor. Montes returned to her apartment that evening, her mind racing as she prepared to transcribe the information she had just transferred. But the weight of her actions was starting to bear down on her, in a way she hadn't anticipated. She sat at her desk, typing up the encrypted messages, but each keystroke felt heavier than the last. The sense of inevitability was overwhelming. She knew it was only a matter of time before her life would change forever. Montes returned to her apartment that evening, her mind racing as she prepared to transcribe the information she had just transferred. But the weight of her actions was starting to bear down on her, in a way she hadn't anticipated. She sat at her desk, typing up the encrypted messages, but each keystroke felt heavier than the last. The sense of inevitability was overwhelming. She knew it was only a matter of time before her life would change forever. The FBI had already prepared for the next phase of the operation. Agents moved quickly, ensuring that Montes would not have a chance to destroy the evidence or flee. They waited until she was alone in her apartment, working at her desk, before they moved in. Montes had no idea that the FBI was mere moments away from arresting her. It wasn't until she heard the sharp knock on her door that she realized everything was about to unravel. The agents swarmed into her apartment, catching her completely off guard. They didn't need to explain why they were there. The weight of the evidence spoke for itself. Montes was arrested that evening. Her carefully crafted life of espionage shattered in an instant. She had been so careful, so meticulous. But in the end, the web of surveillance had caught her. The FBI had been watching her for months, waiting for this exact moment to make their move. Her arrest marked the end of her espionage career. But it was only the beginning of the larger story of how one woman's ideological commitment had led to the compromise of national security. As Montes was taken into custody, the repercussions of her actions rippled across the intelligence community. The damage was done. Now, it was up to the authorities to figure out how much of the information Montes had passed to Cuba, and what further harm her actions could cause. Ana Montes was escorted into a holding room by two FBI agents. The cold steel of the handcuffs around her wrists felt heavier than the burden of her years of betrayal. For the first time in more than 16 years, Montes was confronted with the full weight of her actions. She had lived her life with a purpose. Her allegiance to Cuba had guided her decisions, provided the structure for her entire existence. But now, in the sterile, bright-lit room, that purpose seemed distant and irrelevant. Her past decisions, the ones she had carefully orchestrated, were now exposed. The agency she had served for so many years had turned against her. And now, the people she had betrayed were waiting for answers. Her arrest had been swift, almost anticlimactic in its efficiency. The FBI had been preparing for months, watching her every move, tracking her encrypted communications, following the leads that had begun to converge on her. The evidence against Montes was irrefutable. They had caught her red-handed, transferring classified intelligence to her Cuban handler. It was the final nail in the coffin for her covert life. But Ana Montes had been more than just a spy for Cuba. She had been a brilliant analyst, highly respected by her colleagues at the DIA. She had risen through the ranks, trusted with critical intelligence that had the potential to shape U.S. military strategies and foreign policy. Now, the question was, how much of that information had she passed on to Cuba, and what had the consequences been? The FBI's priority was clear. They needed to understand the full extent of Montes's espionage activities. What had she given the Cubans? How long had it been going on? And who else might be involved? As the agent sat across from her, the room grew tense. Montes' defiance was no longer there. She sat motionless, her back against the cold wall, staring at the table before her. She had been trained to be cautious, to never speak out of turn. But this was different. The game had changed. The rules she had followed for years, the careful balancing of her roles, were no longer in her hands. The first few hours of her interrogation were quiet. The agents made no attempts to question her immediately. They allowed the silence to stretch between them. Montes had been through training, had been taught how to resist interrogation, how to hold her ground. But this was different. The pressure of her own guilt was starting to show. She had never expected to be caught. But now that she was, the reality of her actions was settling in. Finally, the agents began. The questions came slowly, methodically. They were precise, focused on uncovering the information that would fill in the blanks of her covert operation. They knew that the more they could learn about her recruitment, her meetings with her Cuban handlers, and the intelligence she had passed on, the more they could prevent future breaches and protect national security. Montes, for the most part, remained silent. She gave them nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. The agents tried to remain patient, using every tactic they had learned to break down the resistance. They knew that her ideological commitment was deep, and they understood that a direct confrontation might not be the best approach. Instead, they played on her sense of guilt. They hinted at the damage she had caused to the people she had once called colleagues, the lives at risk because of her decisions. As the hours dragged on, Montes' composure began to waver. She had spent years compartmentalizing her life, but now the boundaries between her roles were crumbling. The woman who had once been an idealist, driven by a belief in the righteousness of Cuba's cause, now found herself in a different reality, one where her actions had consequences far beyond her expectations. The agents did not push her too hard. They knew that revealing the full scope of her betrayal would take time. They wanted to break down her defenses, not overwhelm her. Montes had been working as a mole for Cuba for years, but the challenge now was uncovering the full extent of the damage. They needed to know exactly what secrets she had passed to the Cuban government, who her handlers were, and how much damage had been done. By the time the questioning concluded, Montes was physically and emotionally drained. The silence in the room now felt less oppressive, and the weight of her confession settled heavily on her shoulders. She had cooperated, but the price of her actions was already becoming clear. The charges against her were grave: treason, espionage, and the exposure of sensitive intelligence. The sentence she faced was potentially life-threatening. But even as the agents prepared to move her to the next phase of her detention, Montes couldn't shake the feeling that her ideological fight had been justified. She had given her life to a cause she believed in. In her mind, her betrayal was not just a betrayal of her country. It was an act of resistance against a foreign policy she had despised. And though the FBI had caught her, they had not yet understood the depths of her convictions. The agents left her alone in the room, the echoes of her confession hanging in the air. Montes sat quietly, still bound by the consequences of her choices. But there was something in her expression, something that told the story of a woman who had never wavered from her beliefs, even in the face of arrest. The days following Ana Montes' arrest were filled with uncertainty. As the legal process began to unfold, Montes sat in her holding cell, her hands still aching from the handcuffs. But her mind was elsewhere. She could not help but replay the sequence of events in her head. The quiet exchange in the park with her handler, the feeling of inevitability, as she handed over the encrypted discs. It had all felt so normal, so routine. But now, sitting in the sterile confines of a federal detention center, she realized just how far she had fallen. As the FBI continued to build its case, Montes' role in the espionage network was becoming clearer. Her name was already being whispered within the halls of the DIA. Her colleagues, many of whom had trusted her implicitly, were shocked by the revelations. Montes had been a fixture in their daily operations, always at the forefront of Cuban intelligence analysis. Now her betrayal cast a long shadow over the entire department. The confidence they had placed in her was shattered, and the consequences were far-reaching. The FBI was methodical in its investigation. They worked tirelessly to piece together Montes' actions, reconstructing her movements and communications over the years. Her encrypted messages had been carefully scrutinized, and each lead they followed only revealed more of the depth of her espionage. The Cuban intelligence network she had been a part of had far-reaching implications. Montes had not only been a source of valuable information for Cuba, but she had also actively worked to distort U.S. intelligence reports, particularly regarding Cuba. Her actions had helped further the Cuban government's strategic interests, and had placed U.S. military personnel and undercover agents at great risk. Montes knew she had crossed a line that could not be undone. There was no way to retract the damage she had caused. The lives of U.S. agents were in danger, and the integrity of U.S. intelligence had been compromised. In the quiet moments of her confinement, Montes found herself grappling with her motivations. She had always believed in the righteousness of her cause, but now that belief felt distant and hollow. The ideological conviction that had driven her for years seemed meaningless in the face of the destruction it had wrought. Her defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer with experience in espionage cases, visited her in the detention center. Montes' fate now lay in the hands of the legal system. She had already confessed to her actions, and there was little doubt about her involvement in the espionage network. The question now was what her sentence would be. The attorney explained the possible charges and penalties she faced, from espionage to treason, each with severe consequences. The full extent of her betrayal was difficult to process, and the lawyer's words seemed almost distant to Montes. She had known the consequences of her actions, but now that they were real, the gravity of the situation settled over her like a heavy fog. The lawyer explained that the prosecution would likely seek a long sentence, perhaps life imprisonment, but there was also a possibility that a plea deal could be struck. Montes, for all her ideological convictions, knew that her cooperation with the authorities could play a significant role in determining her future. She had already revealed much of what she knew in the hours following her arrest, but the government needed more. They needed to understand how deep the Cuban intelligence network had infiltrated U.S. agencies. They needed her to provide information about other operatives, about the logistics of her espionage operation, and about the full scope of what she had passed on to Cuba. The decision weighed heavily on her. Montes had always believed that she was fighting for a greater cause, that her actions were justified in the name of a better world. Now, as she sat in the cold, sterile room with her lawyer, she realized how much she had lost. The cause she had believed in, the work she had done, all seemed so distant. She had risked everything, and in the end it had been for nothing. The days turned into weeks as Montes faced the legal proceedings. The FBI worked tirelessly to build its case, gathering testimony from colleagues, analyzing documents, and piecing together every thread of information that Montes had passed to Cuba. They knew that Montes' role had been pivotal, but they also suspected that others within the intelligence community had been compromised. Montes' arrest had been just the beginning, and the investigation was far from over. Montes was transferred to a federal facility in Alexandria, Virginia, where she would await her trial. The long hours in her cell gave her plenty of time to reflect on her decisions, on the path she had chosen. She thought about her colleagues at the DIA, many of whom had trusted her implicitly. Some had already been debriefed by the FBI, and Montes knew that the fallout from her actions would stretch far beyond her own fate. The damage was done. Her espionage had not only compromised national security, but it also placed her colleagues in the impossible position of reconciling their loyalty to her with their duty to protect their country. In the days leading up to her trial, Montes faced a constant battle within herself. She was no longer the confident, ideological analyst who had once believed in the righteousness of her actions. She had become a criminal, a traitor to the country she had once served. Her sense of identity, once so tightly bound to her role in the DIA and her commitment to Cuba, had crumbled. She was no longer a trusted analyst or a proud operative. She was now the face of betrayal. Her trial was set to begin in early 2002. The prosecution was clear. Montes had passed sensitive information to a foreign government, endangering the lives of U.S. personnel and compromising the integrity of U.S. intelligence. The charges she faced carried severe penalties, including a possible life sentence. The decision to cooperate with the government, to provide additional information that could lead to the identification of other operatives within the intelligence community, weighed heavily on her. But even as she contemplated the future, Montes knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. The consequences of her actions were irreversible, and now she would have to face them. The trial would not be a simple affair. It would be a national event, a high-profile case that would bring to light the vulnerabilities within the U.S. intelligence community. Montes' betrayal had struck at the heart of the country's defense infrastructure, and her trial would serve as a reminder of the dangers posed by insider threats. As the days counted down to her trial, Montes could not escape the knowledge that her life, as she had known it, was over. But in the quiet moments of reflection, she also realized that the cause she had fought for, the one that had driven her every action, no longer held the same power over her. The ideals she had once clung to had crumbled, and in their place was a stark reality, one that demanded accountability, no matter how painful. Ana Montes sat in the stark, white-walled courtroom, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her mind raced with memories and consequences. The proceedings had started the previous week, and today the government's case was in full swing. Montes had entered a guilty plea in early 2002, but that didn't stop the federal prosecutors from meticulously presenting the evidence in front of her, her family, her former colleagues, and the public. The courtroom was silent, save for the low murmur of the courtroom staff and the clattering of typing machines. Montes was a figure in the center of it all, but to those around her, she might have seemed as though she were already a ghost, tethered only by the weight of her confession. She hadn't looked her lawyers in the eye when they told her of the mounting evidence, nor had she expressed any emotion when they explained that the plea deal they had crafted was her best option. The prospect of life in prison hung over her like a looming cloud, and while she felt the occasional pang of regret for the damage she had done, she had long since made peace with her choices. The prosecution's case was, in many ways, a powerful portrayal of her betrayal. Over the last few days, federal agents had taken the stand, providing testimony about the painstaking investigation that had led to her arrest. Surveillance footage, debriefs from fellow DIA employees, and technical analysis of the encrypted disks she had passed to Cuban handlers all painted a picture of a woman who had infiltrated the very heart of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. Montes, the analyst who had once been trusted with the nation's most sensitive secrets, had violated that trust in ways that were difficult to quantify. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents seized from her apartment had proven that Montes had provided Cuba with the kind of high-value intelligence that could change the course of military operations. The Cuban government had gained insight into U.S. military capabilities, vulnerabilities, and even classified strategies regarding national defense. These revelations hadn't just impacted U.S. policy, they had potentially endangered lives. Her attorney, a seasoned criminal defense lawyer, had advised her to remain silent for much of the trial, to take no further action unless prompted by the court. Montes wasn't entirely sure why she had agreed to the plea deal. The consequences of her espionage were real, and there was no reversing the damage she had caused. Perhaps, though, there was a part of her that hoped that by cooperating with the authorities, she could somehow make amends. Maybe she was clinging to the hope that if she revealed everything she knew, she could somehow find redemption in the eyes of the government. But every time she thought about redemption, she found it more elusive. Montes had convinced herself for so long that her actions were justified, that they were part of a larger ideological battle. The years she had spent carefully building her espionage network had felt like a righteous crusade. She had been a part of something greater, something that transcended national borders, a fight against the forces she believed were wrong. Now, sitting in this courtroom, it was clear that she had been living in a delusion. The personal convictions that had guided her decisions were no longer enough to justify the betrayal of her colleagues, the exposure of American intelligence, and the lives that had been put at risk. The media had been all over the case. Montes was not just a spy. She was a symbol of the vulnerabilities within the U.S. intelligence community. Her arrest had shaken the very foundations of the national security apparatus. How could an analyst within the DIA, trusted with highly classified intelligence, become one of the most dangerous spies to infiltrate the U.S. government in modern history? The public's fascination with her case grew each day. Some saw her as a patriot, fighting against an imperialistic U.S. government. Others saw her as a traitor, no better than the enemies she had secretly aided. Either way, she had become a symbol of the risks that lay hidden within government institutions. During one of the recesses, Montes's attorney took a moment to speak with her. He had been with her throughout the entire legal process, helping her navigate the complex web of espionage charges. He had seen the coldness in her eyes, the calm demeanor that hid the chaos inside. For all her guilt, He knew that Montes believed her actions had been justified by her ideals. Yet, the lawyer also knew that the damage she had caused would overshadow any attempt at redemption. He reminded her that, while her cooperation might mitigate some of the consequences, the government would still have to make an example of her. She had violated the trust of an entire nation. For the public, this trial was about more than just her actions. It was about sending a message to anyone who might follow in her footsteps. The defense had no illusions about the outcome. Montes had already admitted to her role in the espionage operation. There was no denying the extent of her betrayal. The defense's only hope now was to minimize the damage by convincing the court that Montes had acted out of ideological conviction and not out of personal gain. They would argue that her punishment should reflect her belief that she had been working for a higher cause, a cause that in her mind justified the risks. Meanwhile, Montes sat in silence, her thoughts drifting back to the moments when she had first joined the U.S. intelligence community. She had been so young, so full of hope for the future, eager to make a difference in the world. The idealism that had driven her to work for the DIA had never wavered. But over time, that idealism had been twisted, manipulated by her own convictions, until it led her down a path from which there was no return. She had started as a passionate young woman, fighting for what she believed was right. And now, she was a convicted traitor facing the consequences of her choices. The trial continued through the week, and the testimonies grew more and more detailed. Montes' former colleagues testified about her character, about the trust they had placed in her, and about the shock they felt when they learned that their colleague had been feeding the very information they had worked so hard to protect to the Cuban government. The emotional weight of their words was palpable, especially for those who had worked alongside Montes for years, sharing the same office space, the same classified information, the same purpose. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, and it reverberated through the entire courtroom. As the trial entered its final days, Montes found herself on the brink of understanding something profound. She had spent so many years justifying her actions, telling herself that her cause was noble and her methods necessary. But now, sitting in the witness stand, listening to her colleagues describe the impact of her betrayal, she couldn't escape the realization that she had betrayed not just her country, but the very people who had trusted her. The betrayal went deeper than just national security. It went to the heart of human relationships, trust, and loyalty. The case was drawing to a close, and the weight of what was coming next began to sink in. The final verdict was drawing near, and for the first time in years, Montes felt as though she had no control over the outcome. She had lived her life in secrecy, manipulating the world around her, but now it was her turn to face the consequences. The scales of justice were about to tip, and nothing would change the outcome. As the court adjourned for the day, Montes sat back, her mind racing. She had no illusions about what would come next. The future was uncertain, but the reality was clear. The woman who had once believed she was fighting for something greater was now nothing more than a criminal in the eyes of the world. The courtroom was filled with a sense of finality. After weeks of testimonies, mounting evidence, and careful deliberation, Ana Montes sat quietly in her chair, the sound of the judge's gavel echoing in her mind. The trial had reached its end, and the moment she had been dreading was finally upon her. The truth, painful and inescapable, hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and there was no hiding from it. Her actions had been laid bare for all to see. The extent of her betrayal, the damage she had caused, the lives she had risked. Now the question was no longer about what she had done. It was about what would happen next. The prosecution had made its case decisively. Montes had provided Cuba with crucial intelligence, passing on military secrets that compromised U.S. operations and the safety of agents. She had used her trusted position within the Defense Intelligence Agency to leak information about U.S. defense strategies, vulnerabilities, and covert operations. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, when national security was the country's primary concern, Montes had continued her espionage. It was a fundamental breach of the trust that had been placed in her. The case was drawing to a close, and the weight of what was coming next began to sink in. The final verdict was drawing near, and for the first time in years, Montes felt as though she had no control over the outcome. She had lived her life in secrecy, manipulating the world around her, but now it was her turn to face the consequences. The scales of justice were about to tip, and nothing would change the outcome. As the court adjourned for the day, Montes sat back, her mind racing. She had no illusions about what would come next. The future was uncertain, but the reality was clear. The woman who had once believed she was fighting for something greater was now nothing more than a criminal in the eyes of the world. The courtroom was filled with a sense of finality. After weeks of testimonies, mounting evidence and careful deliberation, Ana Montes sat quietly in her chair, the sound of the judge's gavel echoing in her mind. The trial had reached its end, and the moment she had been dreading was finally upon her. The truth, painful and inescapable, hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and there was no hiding from it. Her actions had been laid bare for all to see. The extent of her betrayal, the damage she had caused, the lives she had risked. Now the question was no longer about what she had done. It was about what would happen next. The prosecution had made its case decisively. Montes had provided Cuba with crucial intelligence, passing on military secrets that compromised U.S. operations and the safety of agents. She had used her trusted position within the Defense Intelligence Agency to leak information about U.S. defense strategies, vulnerabilities, and covert operations. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, when national security was the country's primary concern, Montes had continued her espionage, potentially putting the lives of soldiers, spies, and intelligence officers at risk. The damages were incalculable, and the prosecution made clear that Montes' betrayal went beyond espionage. It was a fundamental breach of the trust that had been placed in her. The defense, as expected, painted a different picture. Montes had acted not out of malice or greed, they argued, but out of deep ideological convictions. She believed in the righteousness of Cuba's stance against U.S. imperialism. In her mind, she had been fighting a greater cause. The defense had sought to portray her not as a traitor, but as a misguided idealist, someone who believed she was working toward a world where justice prevailed, even if that meant working against the interests of her own country. They had argued that Montes was driven by an unwavering belief that the Cuban government, and the cause it stood for, was worth the sacrifices she had made. Montes had listened to both sides of the argument, her mind still as she processed the weight of what was happening. Her thoughts had shifted, as they often did during the trial, from the legal proceedings to her life before it all began. The choices she had made felt so distant, so disconnected from the person sitting in the courtroom now. When she had first joined the Defense Intelligence Agency, she had been filled with an ambition to serve her country, to contribute to national security. But somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred, ideological beliefs had overtaken duty, and her quest for meaning had twisted into something darker. In her mind, she had always been on the right side of history. She had seen the U.S. government as an adversary to the cause she believed in, and Cuba, for all its flaws, had represented an alternative to American dominance. She had convinced herself that the information she shared with Cuban intelligence had a higher purpose, one that would prevent future wars, one that would challenge the global power structures that she thought were unjust. But now, with the weight of the trial behind her, she realized how naive she had been. The damage caused by her actions had rippled outward, leaving destruction in its wake. People she had once called colleagues were now left to pick up the pieces of the trust she had shattered the moment the jury deliberations began. Montes found herself reflecting on how her life had changed in the weeks since her arrest. The isolated life she had once lived, one where she juggled her dual identity as an analyst and a spy, had come to a brutal end. Her confinement had been a quiet, suffocating ordeal. She had been alone with her thoughts for so long that the outside world seemed like a distant memory. The bustling streets of Washington, D.C., the colleagues who once admired her expertise, those seemed like another life. Now she was just a prisoner. Her every move watched, her every thought, catalogued by those who had once been on her side. But the trial had forced her to confront something deeper. As she sat in that courtroom, listening to the closing arguments, Montes came face to face with the ultimate consequence of her choices. The pain and destruction she had caused extended far beyond her own life. It had affected the lives of those she had worked with, the agents whose identities she had revealed, and the families who would forever be changed because of her decisions. She couldn't hide from that truth anymore. The judge's voice cut through her reflections, signaling that the jury had reached a verdict. Montes sat up straighter, her hands clenched in her lap. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, it felt unreal. Her heart raced as the judge read the jury's decision. Guilty as charged. The words rang out in the silence of the courtroom. There was no surprise in Montes's expression. She had known this was the inevitable outcome. She had confessed to her actions, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. But even though she had expected this, the weight of the words still hit her like a physical blow. The realization that her life, as she had known it, was over settled deep within her chest. The judge continued with the sentencing phase, outlining the charges she faced: espionage, treason, the exposure of classified intelligence. The potential life sentence loomed over her, and Montes could feel the cold, unrelenting weight of the legal system closing in on her. Her lawyer, who had spent months preparing her defense, looked over at her with a solemn expression. He had done his best, but he knew the facts of the case were stacked against her. There would be no way to avoid the consequences of her betrayal. Montes had been one of the most trusted analysts in the U.S. intelligence community, and she had betrayed that trust in the most profound way possible. There was no way to undo the harm she had caused. The judge's final words pierced the stillness of the courtroom. Ana Belen Montes, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The sentence was delivered with no fanfare, no dramatic pause. It was a quiet, methodical conclusion to a trial that had captured the attention of the nation. Montes stood, her hands shaking slightly, as she was escorted out of the courtroom. The finality of it all was overwhelming. She had fought for a cause she believed in, but in the end, that cause had destroyed her life. As the guards led her out of the courtroom, Montes took one last look at the room where her fate had been sealed. The faces of her colleagues, some of whom had testified against her, remained in her mind. She had once believed they were all on the same team, working toward a better future. Now they were the ones who would continue the work, while she was relegated to a prison cell, the consequences of her choices, her only companion. The gavel struck again, signaling the end of the trial. Montes' life was no longer her own. It had been taken from her by the choices she had made, the path she had chosen so many years ago. The cold walls of the federal prison were a far cry from the world Ana Montes had known just months earlier. Gone were the quiet, orderly days in her DIA office, where she had once pored over documents, analyzing every piece of intelligence. Now everything she had worked for felt like a distant memory, fading beneath the harsh reality of prison life. The sterile fluorescent lights buzzed above, and the walls seemed to close in on her with each passing day. Adjusting to prison was harder than she had anticipated. Montes had never seen herself as a victim of her circumstances. Her decisions were always deliberate, rooted in a belief that she was fighting for something greater. But now, in the silence of her cell, the consequences of her actions were impossible to ignore. Every wall was a reminder of the trust she had broken, the lives she had endangered, and the ideals she had once fiercely fought for. Her days in prison began to blur together. She spent most of her time in solitude, left alone with her thoughts, as she came to terms with the fact that she would never again have the freedom to walk the streets of Washington, D.C., or engage in the debates about Cuba's policies that had once driven her. Instead, she was left to reflect on the life that had led her here. Her recruitment by Cuban intelligence, the years spent feeding them valuable information, and the steady buildup of a double life that had ultimately undone her. But it wasn't just the isolation of prison that weighed on her. It was the guilt. Montes had spent years rationalizing her actions, convincing herself that her spying was a necessary form of resistance, a fight against U.S. imperialism. But the reality of her betrayal felt far more personal now. The harm she had caused wasn't just ideological. It had the potential to destroy lives. The agents whose identities she had exposed would never lead the same life again. The operations she had compromised had disrupted missions that had taken years to plan. Montes couldn't escape the ripple effect of her actions. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of her former colleagues, those she had once trusted, and those who had trusted her. She could no longer ignore the reality that her betrayal had not only harmed the country she had sworn to serve, but had shattered relationships that had once meant everything to her. Montes had been the model employee at the DIA, the expert on Cuba, the person everyone relied on. Now she was a pariah, spoken of with disdain, a stain on the institution she had once been a part of. As the months passed, Montes began to understand that the life she had built was gone forever. The world she had once known no longer existed, and the ideals she had so firmly believed in no longer brought her comfort. The truth she had once fought for now felt distant, a painful reminder of the harsh consequences of her betrayal. The isolation of her cell gave Montes ample time to reflect on the people she had affected. She wasn't a terrorist. She hadn't acted out of malice or with the intention to harm her country. But in many ways, that was what made her actions so dangerous. Montes had justified her espionage in the name of a greater cause, believing the intelligence she passed on to Cuba was worth the risk. Now looking back, she saw how easily she had turned a blind eye to the damage she had caused. Days in prison dragged on, long and monotonous. Montes, in solitary confinement for her protection, spent her time alone in a small, stark cell. Her life was reduced to a simple routine: waking up, eating, reading, and reflecting. There were few distractions, and with nothing to keep her mind occupied, she couldn't escape her thoughts. She wondered if she would ever find peace, or if this prison would be her life's remainder. The memory of her first days in detention lingered. She remembered the calm, almost clinical questions from the FBI agents during her interrogation. She had tried to remain composed, trying to hold on to some semblance of dignity. But with each answer, she had felt a weight lift from her chest, until she realized the weight would never truly be gone. Her confession had been swift, and in many ways, it had sealed her fate. Montes hadn't expected any other outcome. She knew the severity of her crimes. Yet, in the days that followed, she reflected on how entrenched she had been in her beliefs, how those convictions had clouded her vision, and led her to betray everything she had once stood for. Her thoughts were interrupted one day by the appearance of a prison guard, who slid a letter under her door. Montes looked up and saw the Department of Justice's seal on the envelope. It wasn't from her family or a friend, but from the government. The letter outlined the next phase of her sentence and offered a potential path to reduce it. The opportunity to cooperate as an informant. The government wanted Montes' help in dismantling the Cuban intelligence network she had once been part of. Montes wasn't surprised. She had known this moment would come. The government had no doubt recognized the value of her knowledge. The names, the contacts, the methods she had used. It was a chance for her to reduce her sentence. But it came at a heavy cost. She would be expected to cooperate fully, providing the FBI with everything she knew about the network, the contacts, and the extent of her espionage. She sat in her cell, the letter in hand, contemplating the offer. She had been part of something larger, a system of espionage that had spanned years and involved many people. The government needed everything: details on the operations she had helped facilitate, information about the other operatives still active in U.S. agencies. Montes understood that this was her only opportunity to make amends for her actions. Yet the thought of betraying the very network she had once nurtured filled her with conflict. Montes was now at a crossroads. She could cooperate, but that would mean destroying everything she had fought for, exposing those who had once trusted her. The other option was to remain silent, continue serving her sentence in isolation, and live with the consequences of her choices for the rest of her life. There was no easy answer. As Montes considered her options, she realized that her decision was no longer about Cuba or the U.S. It was about her, about the legacy of her actions. She had lived her life in secrecy, but now the truth was unavoidable. There was no way to undo what she had done, no way to erase the harm caused. If she remained silent, she would never escape the woman she had become. But if she cooperated, she could at least help undo some of the damage. The path ahead was unclear, but Montes knew she had to make a choice. The consequences of her actions had shaped her life, and now they would shape the future. The decision sat heavily on Ana Montes' conscience, a burden she couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried to deny it. The government had offered her a lifeline: cooperate with the FBI, dismantle the Cuban intelligence network she had once nurtured, and in return face a reduced sentence, a chance at freedom, a chance at redemption, albeit at a steep price. The betrayal of the very people she had worked alongside for years, the destruction of the last ties she had to the cause she once believed in, loomed over her like a shadow. Sitting in her prison cell, Montes turned the offer over and over in her mind, as if doing so might help her see a way out of the moral labyrinth she had found herself in. On one hand, cooperating with the government would mean a reduced sentence, perhaps a chance at freedom, though not soon. The possibility of her eventual release was tempting, a way to at least escape the isolation of prison. But the cost was steep. Montes would have to provide the FBI with everything: the names of operatives, the methods she had used to pass on intelligence, and the details of the vast Cuban espionage network that had operated undetected for years. To cooperate meant taking down the people she had trusted, the comrades she had fought alongside for so long. It would mean destroying the very network that had defined her actions for over a decade. On the other hand, staying silent would likely cost her freedom for the rest of her life. She would remain in the confines of a cell, forgotten by the world, consumed by guilt over the damage she had caused. But there was a part of Montes deep inside her that recoiled from the thought of betraying those she had once thought of as allies. They had trusted her, fought beside her, and to turn on them now felt like the ultimate betrayal, more painful than any of the espionage she had committed. Her thoughts constantly returned to the ideals that had first driven her to spy for Cuba. When she had joined the DIA, Montes had believed she was contributing to a greater cause. She had been idealistic, convinced that the U.S. government's policies toward Cuba were unjust, and that working with Cuban intelligence was an act of resistance. The U.S. military and its foreign policies had in her mind represented imperialism and oppression. She had seen her role as fighting for something far more noble, a cause that countered what she believed to be an unjust world order. But over time, that belief had eroded. What had started as a quest for justice had turned into a betrayal of the very trust she had sworn to protect. Montes was now trapped by the weight of the decisions she had made. The cause she had believed in so fiercely, the network she had helped build, no longer seemed so clear-cut. The ideals that had once driven her had shattered under the weight of the damage she had caused. And now, she was forced to reckon with the lives she had endangered, the colleagues she had betrayed, and the irreversible damage done to the national security apparatus she had once served. In her solitary confinement, Montes had nothing but time to think. The isolation was suffocating. It was in this silence that she found the most painful realizations. Her actions, once justified by her belief in a greater good, had in fact led to irreparable harm. She had leaked intelligence to Cuba, putting the lives of U.S. agents and military personnel at risk. The people she had once fought for were now the victims of her decisions. The government's offer, though a lifeline, felt more like an unspoken test, one that Montes was struggling to answer. Cooperating with the FBI meant exposing everything, even the people she had once called comrades. It meant destroying the very network that had given her a sense of purpose for years. She could no longer hide behind the belief that she was fighting for a just cause. The reality of her actions was too undeniable. Still, there was another part of her that understood her responsibility. She had the power to help undo some of the damage. Her cooperation could prevent further harm, provide the intelligence the government needed to safeguard U.S. operations, and help identify remaining operatives. It was an opportunity, not for redemption, but for restitution, a chance to right some of the wrongs she had committed, even if it meant betraying those who had stood with her. As days passed in her prison cell, Montes wrestled with this decision. She had justified her actions for so long, but the time for justifications was over. The past couldn't be undone. The choices she had made had irrevocably altered the course of her life. And now, she had to decide how she would face the future. It wasn't about freedom or self-preservation anymore. It was about taking responsibility for the damage she had caused. Montes knew that by cooperating with the FBI, she could help dismantle the Cuban espionage network she had been a part of. She could provide them with the tools they needed to shut down the operations she had helped fuel. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only way forward. If she stayed silent, she would never escape the weight of her actions. By cooperating, she could at least prevent further harm. After several days of internal conflict, Montes made her choice. She would cooperate with the FBI. The decision was painful, a harsh recognition that she could never return to the life she had once known. But it was the only way she could move forward, by confronting the reality of her past and doing what she could to minimize the damage she had caused. Montes felt a sense of finality settle over her as she made the decision. She would help the FBI dismantle the Cuban intelligence network. She would give them everything she knew, from the encrypted communications to the identities of operatives she had worked with. It wasn't about absolution. It was about accepting responsibility for what she had done. It was the only way she could face the future, no longer haunted by the ghosts of her past actions. As she sat in her cell, awaiting the next steps in her cooperation with the FBI, Montes understood that her life had changed forever. She had crossed a line, but perhaps, just perhaps, she could still make a difference. Her decision was the beginning of something new, one shaped by the consequences of her actions and her willingness to confront them. But she knew, deep down, that no matter what she did, there would be no escape from the truth of her betrayal. The decision, like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.